Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida. And today our question comes to us from SkepticPsychologist. And SkepticPsychologist has this question from the deeper end of the pool. And the question is, if we believe in the idea of do as you will but harm none, and existence leads to suffering, should we not therefore take an anti-natalist position? That is to say, the idea that procreation in and of itself is bad because birth leads to suffering in a natural consequence, which is harm. And my answer to this is that if I accepted the premises of this question, I would have to agree. However, I look at it rather differently. And let me walk you through what I would say to this. Firstly, as a Correllian, we have a very particular understanding of do as you will but harm none, and that is that the word harm must be understood in a very traditional way, that you can't be extrapolating it in all kinds of different ways, which some people like to do. And generally we use the shorthand unprovoked or egregious damage. And that doesn't necessarily have to be physical, but it isn't necessarily just hurting someone's feelings. It requires actual damage to occur to constitute harm. That damage can be, again, emotional, but not just hurting someone's feelings. Now, that's the first thing that I would say. The second is the idea that existence automatically leads to suffering, and that suffering constitutes harm. Under our understanding of the term harm from the Wiccan Rede, suffering in and of itself does not necessarily constitute harm. Now, it may arise from harm, but in and of itself it doesn't necessarily constitute that, because suffering is an emotional state, which does not always have an external provocation. There are people who suffer endless tortures purely because of their own psychology, which have no external cause in this life at least, and can be very painful for them, but have nothing to do with the Wiccan Rede or with any kind of harm that has been done to them, at least in this lifetime. I would further say that the idea that existence leads to suffering I would not agree with either. But that has to do with what is suffering and what causes it, which of course is one of the great philosophical questions of history. Buddhists notably have the point of view that suffering is caused by attachment, and if you can let go of all attachments, you will not have suffering. And this is really the whole basis of the idea of Buddhist practice. And as you recall, my understanding of karma is based on attachment, so I'm not entirely in disagreement with that, but I'm not entirely in agreement with it either. And many branches of Christianity hold that suffering ennobles the soul and exists for this purpose, a point of view that I also would not really agree with. Although I certainly agree that we can learn through situations in which we suffer, and I suppose we could say that our soul has been ennobled by that, but I don't think that it's inherently the case. I think it's sometimes the case. My view is that suffering arises from the difference between what you think should be and what actually is. And it comes from false expectations. Now, this is not to say that if you have a bad situation and wish that it would be better, that you are wrong. However, the difference is that if you have a bad situation and you wish to make it better and go about doing that to the best of your ability, that's one thing. It's another thing if you have a bad situation, but for some reason you think it should have been otherwise, for no particular reason except the idea that life should be fair. For whatever reason, the life that we have in this world is not what many people would describe as fair. Now, that would be a whole other question, and I'm not entirely sure that I would agree with that statement, but most people perceive it that way. I would say that because life is shaped by our attachments and our karma, that there is an inherent fairness even when it's not apparent. But most people, again, do not perceive it that way. And I think that most people's suffering arises from their expectation versus their reality. And if they would look at their reality in a realistic way and not worry about where it came from, but rather how to change it, that they would experience far less suffering. I think that part of it is the idea that we live in a fairy tale where everything should be nice, but that's not where we live. And again, if we look at our situations in a realistic way, with a view to changing them, I think that we would avoid a lot of that suffering which comes from our angst over the idea that it should have been different. So I would say that when we talk about suffering, it isn't merely because we exist by any means, it's because of our expectations. And I'm not suggesting that we should change our expectations for the future, but perhaps that we should bring fewer expectations to the present, and rather take things as they are and improve them, rather than worrying about the fact that it isn't as we would have it. If everything was going to be as we would have it, the nature of incarnation would be very different. And we come here to learn, to grow, to experience, and our greatest growth comes through challenges. So naturally they will be there. And the idea that they shouldn't, in my opinion, is a false idea. It is not a truth. Those challenges should be there because they're why we have incarnated here, to learn from and to grow. And if we look at it that way, rather than as a terrible unfairness imposed upon us, I think we have much less suffering. And that's not to say that people's bad actions are not unfair. That's a whole other concept from what I mean. I'm referring to how we look at things in our lives. So what I would say is that, again, suffering arises from the difference between our expectation and our reality, and not merely because we exist. And suffering in and of itself has nothing to do with the concept of harm, because it often doesn't involve any. It just involves not being what you want. Now indeed, suffering sometimes is caused by harm, but that is not inherent to the concept. It is the situation that may be so. And again, often what causes people to suffer has nothing to do with what's going on in terms of other people's actions, or even necessarily the world around them. It can be very internal. And again, it usually is because they expected or believed that things should be different than they are, whether or not what they have is really bad. So, what I would say is that, no, I would not take an antinatalist point of view. Rather, I would say that we're born for a reason, and that reason is to face the challenges of life and overcome them. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but because I believe the soul is immortal, the fact that we do not always overcome our challenges is not inherently bad. So those would be my thoughts on the matter. I hope you find them helpful, and until next time, may you blessed be.
Shadow. Shadow is a term we use to describe feelings that we do not normally think of, but that function as limitations in our lives. The shadow is made up of all the fears, anxieties, and insecurities we carry around with us.
Hi, I'm Reverend Lori Denman, and I'm the Dean of Students at witchschool.com. Our school offers pagan education anywhere, anytime, anywhere in the world. I'd like to answer a question that I get frequently as Dean of Students, and that is, where do I get started? There are so many courses offered at Witch School, over 130 and growing all the time, that people are kind of overwhelmed by our catalog and don't know where to start. There's two courses that I'd like to recommend as a starting place. One is Correllian 101, First Priesthood. Now, even if you're not going to study to become clergy, it is a great course that covers all the beginning concepts of Wicca from the Correllian point of view. The other course I'd like to recommend is Living a Wiccan Life, which is also a 52-week course, as is the first one. And it covers all aspects of living as a Wiccan. So that's really a great place to start course-wise. One feature we have built into the new site allows you to mark courses as favorites. So as you review the course catalog, pick all your favorites, and then you can go back and tackle them as you have room in your roster. If you have any other questions about Witch School, just contact support@witchschool.com.